Welcome to this Unity Netcode for GameObjects tutorial, where I will show you how you can let each player set their own name, and that their name will be displayed above the player object and will be properly synced across the network. Like in this case, player 1 is named root and player 2 is named bin. They can move around and the name will follow the object and they can see each other's names. Let's get started. So first, let's use Unity 6. I will use the 2D built-in render pipeline. I'll give it a name and create project. The first thing we will do inside the Unity editor is open the package manager and search for the Netcode for GameObjects package in the Unity registry. So select Unity registry and look for Netcode for GameObjects. If you can't find it in the list, you can use the search bar and search for netcode and install netcode for GameObjects 1.9.1. It should work with the later versions as well. And then we need to set up a network manager. So create a new empty game object called network manager and add the network manager script to it. In the select transport dropdown, we select Unity transport. Then we can see that it adds this Unity transport script to us, which is exactly what we want. So now we have installed netcode for GameObjects, and if we press play and open this Don't Destroy and Load and select the network manager, we can see 3 buttons: Start Host, Start Server and Start Client. If we select Start Host, we can actually just stop the host, and we have seen that everything works correctly. We have no player object yet, so we couldn't see any player get spawned. Let's create that right now. So create a new game object called player and add some scripts to it. The first script we will add is a network object. Every game object that needs to be synced across the network in a netcode for GameObjects, it requires a network object component. Then we add a rigid body 2D as well, and set gravity scale to 0 and freeze the rotation. The next component we will add is a network transform and untick all the values that we do not care about syncing. So we only care about position X and Y. And make sure you add the network rigid body 2D as well. Then we create a new folder called scripts and another folder called prefabs. Inside of the scripts folder, we can create a new monobehavior script and call it player. Inside of the player script, we can remove all the default code that we get from the template and add a new field for a rigid body 2D that we call RB, and another field that is a float called move horizontal and move vertical, so 2 floats, and a third float for move speed that we set to 4, and a vector 2 for movement. In the start function, we set RB to get component rigid body 2D. And in our update function, we call a method called move that doesn't exist yet. We will create it now. So void move. And inside of the move function, we say move horizontal equals input.getAxisRaw horizontal, and for move vertical we set input get axis raw vertical. Then we set movement equals to a new vector 2 and pass move horizontal and move vertical as parameters and call dot normalized. Then we set rb.velocity equals to movement times move speed. Now if we go back to the Unity editor and press play, don't forget to add the player script to the player object and press play. And now we have no sprite, but if we select the player object, we can add a temporary sprite to it to see if it actually moves. So add component, sprite renderer, and just set a random sprite for now. And we can see that our player is moving. That's awesome. Let's actually give it a real sprite. So go back and add a sprite renderer to the player object, or actually not, remove the sprite renderer and create a child to the player object that is a 2D circle. And give it a color if you want, and press play. Then we can see that our circle is moving around. Now we want each player to get an instance of this player object, so make it a prefab by drag and drop player into the prefabs folder and delete it from the scene. In the network manager, we see the field called player prefab, which we assign our new player prefab to. And now if we press play and go into the network manager and select start host, we will see our player get spawned into the network. To be able to test this with more clients, so we're not only the host, we can install Parallel Sync. So Google for Parallel Sync and select the GitHub repository called Parallel Sync and download zip. Then from the zip folder we drag and drop the Parallel Sync folder into the assets. And then we can go to Parallel Sync and Clones Manager to set up a new clone by create new clone, and then open the new clone and we will see another instance of the Unity editor, so we have two open. Now if we press play on both of them, we can start host on one of them and start client on the other one, and we will see that we have two players now in the scene. But when we try to move from the host, we move both of the clients, and that's not what we want. So let's go back into the player script and make sure that only the owner of the script will move. So instead of inheriting from mono behavior, we inherit from network behavior and add using Unity.netcode as well. And in the update function, before we call move, we will check if is owner is true, or if it's false actually. So if we are not the owner, we just return out of the update function. And if we are the owner, then we call the move function. So now we only move one, but the client still can't move. And that is because Netcode for GameObject is server authoritative by default. So create a new script called client network transform, and we will set server authoritative to false. So client network transform should inherit from network transform, and then we can override the on is server authoritative to and just return false instead of returning anything else. And now we should replace the network transform on our player object. So instead of having a network transform, we want to have the client network transform. And that basically just means that each client can control themselves and do not have to ask the server, like, can I move here? And the server has to say yes. Instead, we just, by being client authoritative, the client can just say, move my client here, and the server accepts it. So make sure we only sync the X and Y position, and add the network rigid body 2D as well, because that got removed when we removed the network transform. And now if we press play again, we should be able to move the host and the client separately. So we start the host on the left window and we start the client on the right window. And look at that. We can now properly move the host to the left and the client to the right. Now, to make each player able to set their own name and have it synced across the network, we need to create a new game object called UI Manager that will hold the input field. So create a new script as well called UI Manager. Then we assign it to the UI Manager object, and inside of the script we remove the base template and just add a serialize field input, and make it public as well. So public TMP input field called name input field. And another serialize field button for the host button and one for the join button, so we don't have to use the network manager object when we want to host or join a game. Instead, we can set up some real buttons. So right click and select UI button and import TMP essentials, as we need to do. Position the button wherever you want. This will be the host button. So we make it a little bigger and set the text to host, and make a copy of it and set the text to join for the join button. Then give them colors if you want. And on the canvas, we add a new UI input field. Sorry you can't see it, but I'm sure you will find it anyway. So it's a TMP input field. Size it however you want. And change the placeholder to enter name instead of enter text. Now on the UI Manager, we can assign these fields or these elements to each field. Just name them properly, so host button, join button, and input field is fine. So drag and drop the host button into the host button field, and the same for the join button and input field. And now in the UI Manager script, we make our start function and set up our host button. So host button on click, add listener. Then we will call the start host function. So call network manager and using Unity.Netcode and network manager.singleton.start host. And we need to make an arrow function since it returns a bool. So call start host in that function, and then we do the same for join button. On click add listener network manager.singleton.start client instead of start host. So now if we press play, we can see our host and join button, and we can just click host and join instead. And it works just as before, but now we have some real buttons for it. Now we can create the name text object, so that will hold the player name. So right click the player prefab and make a new game object called name text. Drag and drop it wherever you want it to show up, and add a text mesh pro text. Make sure it's not text mesh pro GUI. It should be text mesh pro text. Set the text to player 0 as default and set the font size to 8 or whatever you want. I will go with 8 and shrink the size a little. Make it bold and put it in the center. And if you want, you can also give it an outline and set the thickness to something like that. I'll go with 0.36. Now if we press play and make a host and make a client, we can see everyone is player 0, so they can't set their own names just yet, but we will fix that now. So to do that, we create a new script called player settings. So it can hold more things than just player name, but for this tutorial it will just be for the player name. Call it player settings anyway, and drag and drop player settings onto the player object and open the script. Remove the base template and add a new serialize field for the name. So serialize field private text mesh pro and player name. Then we create a new network variable which comes with Netcode for GameObjects. We make player settings inherit from network behavior instead of mono behavior. And the network variable should be of type fixed string, 32 bytes. Import Unity collections. Call the variable network player name and assign it to a new network variable fixed string 32 bytes. Set the default value to unknown for now. Then we override the on-network spawn, which happens every time a client spawns into the network. And we check if is owner, so if we are the owner of this script that is attached to our player, we set the network player name.value equals GameObject.find UI manager. So we find our local UI manager by calling GameObject.find. Then we get the UI manager component out of it and call the name input field .text. So we set the network player name to the text that we added to the input field. Just clean up the code a little. Then we call network player name dot on value changed to subscribe to whenever this network variable changes. It should be synced across the network. So we subscribe to network player name on value changed and create that method soon. First, before we subscribe, we set the player name.text equals to network player name.value.toString to make sure that it is initially set. And now we create a new void network player name underscore on value changed, which is the method we subscribed to. And it takes two parameters, previous value and new value, both of type fixed string 32 bytes. And whenever the value is changed, we set player name.text equals new value.value to update the player name text whenever the variable changes. So if we now try it out, we can see it doesn't work yet. And for some reason it seems to be a bug with this fixed string 32 bytes in this netcode for GameObjects version. So we will create a new struct to use as the type instead of fixed string 32 bytes. So at the bottom of player settings, we create a new public struct network string that inherits from iNetwork serialized by memcpy, which is short for memory copy. We create a new variable called private force network serialized by memcpy of type fixed string 32 bytes, call it _info. And you don't need to understand everything that is going on here, just follow along and it will work. So public void network serialize of type T, pass the buffer serializer T called serializer, where T is of type iReaderWriter. Call serializer.serializeValue ref and pass the _info. Then we override string to string to return the correct value when we call toString. So _info.value.toString. And public static implicit operator string network string s arrow function s.toString. And we make this so we don't have to call .value every time we use the network string. So then we set a public static implicit operator network string and string s equals new network string, and make sure it's an arrow function and not just an equal sign. And set _info equals to new fixed string 32 bytes s. So now that we have this, we can copy this network string value, and instead of use fixed string 32 bytes, we paste the network string instead. And then we can remove .value from new value. And make sure you assign player settings to the player prefab. And then we can press play. Start a host and start a client. Now we can set the name in the input field. So let's set root bin. And for the client, we set subscriber. And as we can see, we have each of the players' name synced across the network, and both players can see the other player's name. That was all for this video. Make sure you do as the client and become a subscriber. And I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.